Chronicles of Ancient War. What if? What if Miyamoto Musashi had died at Sekigahara? The moment of divergence. On October 15, 1600, a single musket ball changed the course of Japanese history. Not the one that was fired, but the one that should have been. This is the story of how the death of a 17-year-old boy in Sekigahara created a Japan we never knew, a world where the greatest swordsman in history died before he could become legend. Today we explore an alternate reality, where Miyamoto Musashi, the man who would become invincible, never emerged alive from feudal Japan's greatest battlefield. The last dawn of Benosuke. In this alternate timeline, everything began exactly as it did in real history. Benosuke Hirata, not yet known as Miyamoto Musashi, was marching with Western forces through the icy mists of Sekigahara. At 17, he had already proven himself a formidable warrior, but he was still just another young Ronin, thirsting for glory in a war that would decide the future of Japan. The young man who would one day be called Invincible awoke this October morning with the same hunger for battle we know from real history. His eyes shone with the same deadly intensity. His two swords sang the same promise of transcendent violence. Nothing in his posture or demeanor suggested that this would be his last day on Earth. But in this reality, the gods had plotted a different fate. The battle began, as we always know it, Tokugawa versus the Western coalition, 60,000 men converging in a deadly dance that would redraw the political map of Japan. Benosuke fought with the same savage ferocity we've admired in our previous narratives, his blades reaping lives like a storm reaps wheat. For hours it seemed this extraordinary young man would once again transcend the limits of human mortality. He killed dozens of enemies, survived attacks that would have shattered veteran warriors, and danced among blades like a force of nature who had learned to wield steel. But then came the moment that changed everything. During the collapse of the Western formation, when Kobayakawa's betrayal sealed the fate of the battle, Benosuke found himself surrounded by soldiers from the Eastern forces. It was a situation he had faced before, one he would face again in real history. But this time something different happened. A veteran musketeer positioned on a nearby ridge had been watching the young demon dancing among his companions like an angel of death. He had waited patiently for the right moment, calculated the perfect trajectory, anticipated the movement that would expose his target. When Benosuke raised both swords to execute the double strike that would become his lethal signature, he exposed the gap between his makeshift armor for a split second. It was an opening that would last less than a breath, but it was all the skilled marksman needed. The shot echoed over Sekigahara like thunder, announcing the end of an era that would never be born. Silence where there should be legend. Benosuke's death went unnoticed in the greater chaos of Sekigahara. Another young Ronin fallen in a battle where tens of thousands faced the same fate. His body was found days later by looters who saw only another corpse to scavenge, not realizing they had stumbled upon the remains of someone who could have become the greatest swordsman in history. No poet composed verses about his death. No chronicler recorded his last words. No fencing school preserved his revolutionary techniques. The young man who, in our timeline, would become Miyamoto Musashi simply disappeared from history, leaving only the silent echo of unrealized potential. In the weeks following the battle, as Tokugawa consolidated his power and reshaped Japan according to his vision, no one noticed the absence of a ghost that never came to haunt the world. The roads Musashi would have walked remained empty of his transformative presence. The opponents he would have defeated lived on, confident in their own unchallenged supremacy. Munisai Hirata, the dead young man's father, received the news through a messenger who brought few details beyond the confirmation that his son had died with honor serving the Western cause. The elderly fencing instructor wept not only for the loss of a son, but for the strange feeling that something important had been lost with him, something even he could not define. There was a different light in his eyes, Munisai murmured to himself during the lonely nights that followed, as if he could see things others couldn't, as if he was destined for something greater than any of us could imagine. But destinies can be cut like threads of silk, and the greatest martial talent Japan had ever produced had become just another statistic in a war that created thousands of orphans and widows. The world kept turning without Miyamoto Musashi, and initially, no one noticed the difference. But the ripples of an absence can be as powerful as the ripples of a presence. And gradually, as the years passed, Japan began to evolve in ways that could only be understood in retrospect. Ways shaped not by what happened, but by what never had the chance to happen. The era that should have been defined by the revolution in swordsmanship would be defined by its stagnation. The man who should have transcended all traditional schools never existed to challenge them. And so the old forms remained supreme, crystallized in a perfection that would never be tested by anyone truly capable of surpassing them. The eternal reign of the ancient schools. Without Miyamoto Musashi to revolutionize the art of the sword, the Japanese martial world evolved according to completely different patterns. The traditional schools of swordsmanship, Yoshioka, Yagyu, Itoryu, and dozens of other ancestral lineages, maintained their positions of unchallenged supremacy, crystallizing into a hierarchy that seemed destined to endure forever. The Yoshioka school, which in our timeline was shattered by Musashi's fury, flourished as never before. Without the dual sword demon to challenge them, the Yoshioka masters cemented their position as supreme arbiters of Japanese martial excellence. Yoshioka Seijuro lived into his 80s, passing on secret techniques to a new generation who sincerely believed they had achieved absolute perfection in the art of combat. Our school represents the pinnacle of 800 years of refinement, Seijuro declared in his later years, unaware of how close he had come to finding someone capable of proving such a pinnacle an illusion. The techniques we preserve are national treasures, honed through generations to their final form. This achieved perfection mentality spread throughout the Japanese martial arts establishment. Masters who in our timeline would have been forced to evolve or perish in the face of Musashi's challenge remained comfortable in their certainties, teaching kata that had become rituals rather than preparation for actual combat. The most profound consequence was philosophical. Without Musashi to demonstrate that transcendent technique arose from a free spirit rather than from rigid adherence to prescribed forms, the Japanese martial world became progressively more conservative, more hierarchical, and more resistant to innovation. Young warriors who in our timeline might have been inspired by the example of a Ronin who transcended all traditional schools through sheer determination were taught to revere established authority and be suspicious of anything that challenged accepted orthodoxy. The very concept of Bushido evolved differently. Without the example of Musashi, a man who had developed original martial philosophy through intense personal experience, Bushido remained more connected to traditional social structures and less focused on individual transcendence. When the Meiji Restoration arrived in 1868, it found a samurai establishment far more unified and traditionalist than the one we know from real history. The samurai of this alternate timeline had spent centuries without having their fundamental certainties tested by truly revolutionary forces. This would make them much more resistant to the modernization that was about to engulf Japan. The samurai resistance. When forced modernization arrived in Japan in the 1850s, it found a samurai class radically different from the one we know from real history. Without the disruptive example of Miyamoto Musashi, who had proven that exceptional individuals could transcend traditional limitations through sheer determination, the samurai mentality had crystallized into a much more conservative and collectivist form. The result was a resistance to westernization, far more fierce and coordinated than anything our timeline has experienced. Led by the heirs of the great martial schools, who saw modernization as an existential threat not only to their privileges, but to the very soul of Japan, significant groups of samurai organized themselves in a resistance that combined religious fanaticism with legendary martial mastery. Saigo Takamori, the leader of the last samurai rebellion in our timeline, found much broader and more sophisticated support in this alternate reality. The Yoshioka and Yagyu schools and other prestigious martial houses financed and organized an insurgency that transformed the Satsuma Rebellion into a genuine civil war lasting not months, but years. They have allowed foreign spirits to contaminate our sacred land. Yoshioka Denshichiro, who in this timeline lived to old age, declared in a manifesto that was secretly circulated throughout Japan. They have exchanged the wisdom of our ancestors for soulless machines, We, guardians of the true traditions, vow to resist until every Western demon is driven from our sacred soil. The war that followed was brutal beyond anything our timeline has known. Traditional samurai, united in common cause for the first time in centuries, proved that swords in the right hands could still compete with modern rifles, at least when wielded by men willing to die for principles they considered more important than life. Epic battles were fought across Japan, with masters of ancient schools leading suicidal charges against fortified positions, using tactics that blended classical Bushido with modern guerrilla warfare. Entire cities became battlefields where tradition and modernity clashed, not just as conflicting philosophies, but as literal armies determined to destroy each other. The Meiji government, facing much fiercer resistance than expected, was forced to make concessions that delayed Japanese modernization for decades. Traditional elements that were quickly suppressed in our timeline negotiated positions of power here, allowing them to preserve significant aspects of samurai culture within the new order. The Japan that could have been. By the early 20th century, the Japan of this alternate timeline emerged as a radically different nation from the one we know. Prolonged samurai resistance had forced a historic compromise between tradition and modernity that created a unique cultural synthesis, more conservative than the real Japan, but also more spiritually cohesive. Industrialization continued, but more gradually and carefully. Factories were built according to principles that respected traditional hierarchies. Technology was adopted, but always filtered through considerations of its impact on social and spiritual harmony. More importantly, Japanese martial culture retained much greater practical relevance. Fencing schools became not historical curiosities, but vital institutions that continued to produce genuine warriors. Kendo and other martial arts maintained a direct connection to real combat, not degenerating into sports or nostalgic rituals. By the time World War I broke out, this alternative Japan possessed a much more cohesive and confident cultural identity. It felt no need to prove legitimacy through Western imitation because it had successfully integrated modernity with tradition in a way that satisfied both impulses. The result was a very different foreign policy. This Japan was more isolationist, but also more confident, less aggressive, but also less willing to compromise. It didn't need to conquer other countries to prove it was civilized by Western standards, because it had developed its own standards that it considered superior. The tensions that led to Pearl Harbor and the catastrophe of World War II in our timeline were much less pronounced in this reality. This Japan had less need to confront the West because it had found a way to coexist with modernity without sacrificing its soul. Paradoxically, without Miyamoto Musashi to revolutionize individual martial arts, Japan as a nation developed a much more balanced approach to dealing with external pressures and internal changes. The question remains, would this be a better world? A Japan that was more traditional but also more stable, less innovative but also less prone to the extremes that characterized our timeline? Like all alternative history questions, the answer depends entirely on which values we consider most important. Individual progress versus social harmony, innovation versus continuity, personal transcendence versus cultural cohesion, the echo of the absent. In the end, the most profound question raised by this alternative history is not about politics or economics, but about the nature of the exceptional individual and their impact on history. Miyamoto Musashi was not just a skilled swordsman or even an inspiring philosopher. He was a force of nature who challenged every assumption about what was possible for a human being to achieve through dedication and will. His life demonstrated that individuals could transcend all limitations imposed by society, tradition, and even physical reality. His untimely death in Sekigahara removed from the world not only an extraordinary individual, but an entire paradigm of human potential. Without his example, Japanese culture developed along lines that emphasized collective harmony over individual transcendence, traditional wisdom over revolutionary innovation. It's a trade-off that many might consider worth making. Japan without Musashi was probably more stable, more harmonious, and less prone to the extremes that characterized our timeline. But it was also less dynamic, less innovative, and less willing to push boundaries than thought possible. The real tragedy is not that a young man died on a battlefield. Millions have shared that fate throughout history. The real tragedy is that with his death, humanity lost proof that certain types of greatness are possible. In nossa timeline, quando people doubt que individual will can overcome qualquer obstacle, they can point para Miyamoto Musashi. Quando question se traditional limitations can ser transcended through pure determination, his life provides definitive answer. In the timeline where he died at 17 in Sekigahara, this proof never existed, and so Japanese culture, and perhaps human culture as a whole, settled to a lower ceiling than might have been possible. The butterfly effect of a single bullet changed not only political history but also spiritual history. It changed not only what happened, but what people believed was possible. That perhaps for your greatest loss de all, the bullet that changed the world. A single bullet, fired in a moment of chaos on a freezing October morning, altered not only the course of a life, but the trajectory of an entire civilization. In our timeline, Miyamoto Musashi became living proof that human beings can transcend any limitation through pure will and absolute dedication. His life became a lighthouse for all who dare to dream beyond conventional boundaries. But in an alternate timeline, that lighthouse was never built, and so humanity navigated through history with one less star to guide its way. Sometimes the greatest tragedy is not what happens, but what never gets the chance to happen. What do you think? Would the world be better or worse without the example of individual transcendence that Miyamoto Musashi provided? Let us know in the comments below.